Hello and welcome to this webinar where we'll be discussing using a data-driven approach to defend against cyber threats. Our panel today consists of two distinguished guests beside myself, Lance Taylor from Clear and Chris Jacob from ThreatQuotient. Lance is Manager of Intelligence and Threat Management at Clear and is a 22-year Air Force veteran with a long career in intelligence and cyber. He has worked at the Air Intelligence Agency and the U-2 reconnaissance mission as a Korean translator. He spent the second half of his career building out the Air Force's cyber presence throughout the world. As a senior instructor, Lance and a cadre of fellow officers and enlisted instructors were tasked by the Air Force to revamp the cyber officer program from a support mission to a future in cyber warfare. The course is still used today to train the Air Force's cyber warriors of the future. Lance is also an avid photographer, having actually made his living as a professional photographer for a while after retiring from the Air Force. Rumor has it that if you catch him at just the right time, you might be able to convince him to photograph a wedding. Chris is Global Vice President, Threat Intelligence Engineers at ThreatQuotient and leads a global team of engineers in working with prospects and customers to assess their current approach to intelligence, understand their needs, and provide them with a product-driven solution. Chris has over 15 years of experience in information security, beginning with serving as Battalion Information Systems Coordinator during his time in the Marine Corps, and including leadership positions at SourceFire, Fidelis Cybersecurity, and WebRoot. A little known fact about Chris is that should the cybersecurity gig not work out, he can always make a career as a lacrosse commentator. Lance and Chris, welcome.
Thank you.
My name, finally, is Moritz Lucas, and I'm Director of Product Marketing at Intel 471. I've been in cybersecurity for about 20 years, starting off, in cyber threat intelligence for about 11, starting off by running the threat intel team for a European cybersecurity company way back in 2011, when we were chasing after mostly Russian-speaking actors who wanted to do terrible things to the balance of their online bank account, or steal your credit card data, or both. From a variety of positions with cyber threat intelligence companies, I have seen firsthand how that ecosystem developed from its humble beginnings into the sophisticated cyber underground that we are faced with today, with actors that cause impacts that are so profound that states of emergency are declared and presidential press conferences mention them by name. So in today's webinar, we'll start off with a very brief overview of the cybersecurity landscape as seen from an attacker's perspective. I'll give you a brief overview of the current state of the cyber underground. But the main focus of today's webinar will be the open discussion with our esteemed panelists on a variety of topics. We've prepared some questions beforehand, but we encourage you to get involved. You can submit questions or comments during the discussion through the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I can't promise we'll be able to get to all of your suggestions, but we'll try and cover off as many as we can. Then Chris will talk about the role of automation in cybersecurity and what products and approaches can help you automate cybersecurity processes. And finally, I'll talk about how cyber threat intelligence can fuel automation and helps lead to positive outcomes, as well as briefly covering the methodology we developed to make this process measurable and repeatable. So we'll start off with a little overview of the cybersecurity landscape. Have you ever heard about the psychological trick where you ask someone not to think of an elephant, and what is the only thing they can think about? An elephant. Well, I apologize in advance for what I'm about to do to you, as I want you not to think of an iceberg when discussing the cyber underground, while showing you a picture of an iceberg. You often hear the cyber underground referred to as the deep and dark web, sometimes complete with a picture of said iceberg. That term and that image are both wrong. They conjure up images of something vast, nebulous, and mysterious. The truth is actually the opposite, and that has everything to do with a fundamental aspect of many of the threats that we are faced with today. They are not the work of one actor or even one group of actors. Instead, they are the work of different groups working together in some way, where each member benefits from being a small part of a bigger whole. We can think of them as chains or cycles or business processes, economic value chains. The key part is that they are made up of different participants all working together in some way. And a participant can be a member of multiple chains at the same time. much like a business has multiple customers or produces different products and services for different markets. And that is a much better and more accurate way of thinking about the underground as a marketplace. It is limited in size and structured. The actors that inhabit it create that structure. They do this because they are always looking for new actors or groups to partner with, as a supplier or as a consumer. And by creating this structure, it makes it easier for others to find you, or for them to know that you're interested in or looking for something. And you know where to go if you want to plan or discuss a particular topic. So, like a marketplace, the underground has specific areas focusing on specific subjects. If you're interested in bulletproof hosting, go to this forum. If you want to buy credentials, go to this marketplace, etc. And because it is limited in size and fairly structured, we can map out that structure, identify and track the top tier actors, the movers and shakers in this environment. And by keeping an eye on who is working with whom, what actors are building and selling, we can gain valuable insights into potential threats even before they materialize, because we are tracking what goes into an attack, for instance. The key developments over the past years have been the continuing growth and development of this cyber underground, with new products, services, and goods being developed, and actors finding new ways to combine existing elements together to create whole new categories of threats. The huge increase in ransomware and extortion attacks are prime examples of this. Another example of this growing maturity is that the offerings and actors in the cyber underground have become so sophisticated and mature that we are actually seeing the spheres of nation-state actors and financially motivated actors increasingly starting to overlap. So, faced with such a wide range of threats, their increasing impacts as IT and the internet increasingly become critical foundations for our organizations, how can we best organize our defenses? On to the open discussion, where we'll hear about some of the experiences from our panelists. Now, we've prepared some questions beforehand, but this is an open discussion, so if you want to join in, just type in your question or comment into the Q&A box on the right-hand side. And I'll start off with a question for Lance, if I may. How is Clear organized to face cyber threats?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be here. And what I'll say as far as organizing to face the cyber threats is that it is crucial for us to maintain a holistic view of the threat space. And what I mean is monitoring OSINT reporting, premium feeds, telemetry and file reputation, and cyber ground chatter, for example. And by maintaining also an awareness of your topology and your own high value assets, promoting automation and scalability wherever you can, because as your organization grows, it's going to be paramount to be able to respond and pivot to that for your defenses. And then finally, providing your stakeholders with relevant data to help aid in risk-based decision-making. I think those are some of the primary points to help any organization as a best practice maintain an awareness of the threat landscape and keep defenses commensurate with that.
Okay. And how would you describe the challenges your team is most frequently facing when they try to solve security operations issues?
I think like any organization, you always have this sense of not enough money, not enough people. And unfortunately, the reality is that we live in a world of resource constraints, and we don't have all the money in the world and all the people in the world to do the things that we want. And so your best bet is just to maximize the use of your resources and make sure that when you decide on what defenses that you can sustain that, when you decide on what defenses to implement within your organization, that's something that's sustainable with the resources you have, both money and people, which is why I'm such a huge fan of automation, because that's one way to empower a smaller number of individuals to do something that has organization-wide impact. Also, the threat landscape is ever-changing. I think we've seen over the last several years that the cyber underground has evolved immensely. And I would even say that it has even gone to the point of mimicking Amazon. You have customer support tickets, you have store credit, you have all these things that you see in legitimate businesses, except in this case, they are for illegitimate purposes. And staying abreast of those changes and knowing how to pivot your defenses is really crucial for your organization. And then finally, learning to live with uncertainty, as Intel 471 well knows, and anyone who's ever worked in intelligence, that you're never going to have the definitive answers. You're never going to know that you are 100% correct. The best you can do is learn to live with uncertainty and realize that you can try and get as much information as you possibly can to support or refute whatever hypothesis you have, and then roll with that. You have to roll with the information that you have available, and hopefully more times than not, you're correct. And whatever defenses you prepare to mitigate whatever threats you might see turn out to be the right ones for your organization.
I think certainly the more money, more people thing, I think, will resonate with large parts of the audience. I think we all imagine if you always did get more money, more people, most organizations at some point would start to resemble a very small core part of what they're actually trying to accomplish, surrounded by a very big bit, which they called IT security or cybersecurity. They always want more money, more people. That, of course, doesn't work. So on that topic, is kind of faced with the fact that I suppose your workload is increasing every year. Every year there are more subjects being added to your plate of things that you need to do or be aware of. Are efficiency gains one of the things you look for when you're looking at vendors or looking at solutions?
Efficiency gains, did you say?
Yes, they're not trying to do something new, but simply trying to do the same thing you were before, but with less resources.
Yeah. So, honestly, anytime that I evaluate a vendor, before I say that, one thing that I always say when I work with vendors or discuss potential vendors to bring on is that I am information greedy. I want all the things, I want all the feeds, all the information, and I want to be able to figure out from all of that information what's relevant to our organization and what is relevant to my mission and my plan, my strategic direction for the intelligence program at Clear. And I would love to just sort it out myself. But as I mentioned before, with the resource constraints, I have to be realistic and say, okay, all the feeds are not going to come to me. I have to figure out from those feeds which ones give us the best bang for our buck and which ones provide the capabilities that I need to further the mission that I have in growing the program. So efficiency is definitely one of those, and that goes for the vendor as well. If the vendor is responsive to any requests that I might have or any changes that I would like to see with how we are using the product, I would love for the vendor to be responsive to that. And thankfully, they all have. We all have I think a shared mission to protect the industry as a whole, but it is crucial for me to be able to protect my mission and the things that I put value in. And so I definitely seek out efficiency wherever I can, and automation is one of those things to leverage large data sets and be able to streamline the information that comes out of those data sets, so that when I evaluate the threats that I see, I have the right information at the right time.
Okay. So we talked, the word automation was mentioned. I think this is the bit where Chris, I've once heard it said that for cybersecurity, for an industry that is so focused on basically looking at the very raw material we work with is IT, is that you seem to be, there's a certain lack of, really hesitant to use automation ourselves. And that we do a lot of things manually. There's a lot of things that we could do more effective, more efficient if we automated them. Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right, and just keying off a couple of things that Lance said. I mean, we're always have been faced with and I apologize, the town I live in seems to be burning down at the moment. We're always faced with budget constraints and people constraints, and automation helps a lot in that. But and that's sort of the obvious way of finding some return on investment. But I think if you look at the larger picture of threat intelligence in general, which is for some of us that have been around for a while, a relative new part of the overall infosec or cybersecurity world. And I think that there has been, there's been quite a bit of money invested in it. And depending on the program, a lot of times there's a disconnect between what the Intel team's doing and what the C-suite thinks the Intel team is doing. But at the end of the day, Lance gathering all this information, digging through this information, contextualizing it. What do I need to know to be able to protect clear? Then there's that final mile, right? There's that, well, now how do we share this information with the stakeholders, right? And that, I think, is where automation comes into play. I mean, of course, there are human consumable reports that you will send to the C-suite, but really what we're trying to accomplish here is making sure, again, it's a money issue, right? We've leveraged, we've invested in firewalls and IPSs, in SIMs, in vulnerability management systems. We've invested all this money. How do we make them better without having to replace them? And I think automation and the work that Lance and his team do is what feeds into that final mile. It's the ability to be able to almost be a product owner, and that product is the contextualized threat intelligence, and how do I deliver that product to the stakeholders, or another way to look at it is to my customers, right? So Lance has customers throughout the organization that need to consume the product that he's building. And I think automation is the step to getting to that point, because it can be much faster and much more efficient than human to human.
I think agreed. So, Lance, I think the part that you're trying to strike would it be correct that you're trying to strike a balance. On one hand, you have the resource constraints. On the other hand, I like your thinking. I want all the information and all the data. From the viewpoint that probably nobody knows more about Clear and what Clear is trying to achieve than you do. So you'd like to make up your own mind, I suppose. But is this also something where you work with the vendors, for instance, to kind of at least share some of those insights so they can kind of draw your attention, or kind of already kind of order things for you, so that you know what you can quickly spot the relevant bits of intelligence or information?
Yes, 100%. I have a very, very close relationship with the vendors that I work with. So much so that many of them have become friends over time. And as they've moved on to other companies and other teams, I still maintain that friendship, because, I want to make sure that we maximize the use of every tool that we have available. And that means working with the vendor very closely and saying, okay, well, here's what I identify as our need, and how your product can help solve that. And I want to find out, are we, from your vantage point, because you can see across your customer base how your customers are using this tool, are we maximizing the use of this tool for ourselves? Or is there something out there that we should be doing? I'm always in learning mode when it comes to threat intelligence and how to leverage some of these platforms. And I'm always happy to benefit from the experiences of others who have been in this industry much longer than I have. And since I spent my life in the military, I've only been in public sector until recently. So I'm happy to learn from their experiences, and I won't hesitate to reach out often to the vendors and ask questions about maximizing the tool, using every feature that they have available in their platform, and in some cases, even developing new capabilities with their platform through the use of feature requests and things like that. So I always worry that vendors think, man, this guy's got a lot of feedback, but the vendors have said, no, that helps us grow our product. So I'm happy to have that symbiotic relationship with the vendors in the interest of efficiency and relevancy.
Good. So we actually have some questions from the audience coming in. I see a couple that are we kind of put together some kind of guide for this discussion. There are some that will come in a bit later on, so we'll jump into those. But here's an interesting one. What are each of your top one thing for a team getting started in building out a threat intel operation in order to prove the usefulness of hiring on or bringing on a threat intel vendor?
That's a great question.
An interesting question.
Yeah, so let me just reread that. So getting started, building out a threat intel operation, usefulness of hiring on a threat intel vendor. Okay, so I would say number one, identifying your needs within your organization. What are your threat intelligence needs? What information can your team, the security team, benefit from to learn what the threats are that are facing your organization? And so I would say number one, identifying your threats and your high value assets and figuring out how do we protect those high value assets. Number two, understanding the topology of your organization. How are those high value assets accessible to not only internally to our organization, but how are they potentially accessible from the outside, from the public? And that will help guide what your needs are in terms of securing that. And then once you've identified what your needs are, using that to determine what information do you need from an intel vendor in order to support securing those high value assets. So I would say that's the first point. Second point is understanding the intelligence lifecycle and understanding how to leverage each point in that cycle, namely identifying your internal stakeholders. Who are the internal stakeholders to our organization that can benefit from the information that we output at the end of that cycle when we start reporting and disseminating that reporting. And so knowing who your internal stakeholders are will help you identify what your needs are. Because if you are supporting, let's say, what I call vulnerable teams, those teams that deal with the external public the most and are susceptible to, let's say, phishing attacks or social engineering, how can I inform them of what the latest phishing lures are, the latest techniques used by the threat actors to trick them into giving up information or giving up access? So that, let's say, for example, would help me identify, okay, I have a need to understand what the latest phishing lures are. So maybe I start looking into vendors who specialize in phishing, or an premium intelligence vendor who has visibility into some of these spam networks and understand what the lures are within each of those networks. So I think starting with internal stakeholders and also identifying what your high value assets are and what you need to secure those will help drive your needs for intelligence and understanding what the threats are and how they are implementing those threats or executing those threats against organizations.
So the only thing that I would add to that, I think that's a pretty comprehensive answer. The only thing that I would add is that you need to develop a methodology to measure the effectiveness, right? At the end of the day, everything is a money problem. You're spending money on platform vendors, intel vendors. You need to develop a way to say, am I spending my company's money correctly? And that could be, it's hard to measure what you're preventing. That's always been a challenge in InfoSec. But, looking even at, again, going back to the other teams, the other stakeholders, looking at your impact on their efficacy, right? Is your SOC decreasing the number of false positives? Are you blocking more on your IPSs? Are you come up with a way to measure your team's impact on the rest of the security organization? Because I think that's something that Intel teams and really security teams in general forget to do, and that's market themselves within the organization. Be able to say, because of the work this team has done, we've reduced the number of false positives by X, or we've increased the number of, the efficacy of our EDR by Y. And having those metrics, you can't justify your existence without being able to show your impact on the overall organization.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Chris, because that's one point that I say all the time. How do you measure the value of preventing something? It's very, very difficult to do that. Mm-hmm. And metrics is something that I certainly struggle with as far as learning how to measure the value of the intelligence, because your goal is to prevent things from happening. Right. And one more point to, I guess, sort of flesh out what you just added is that by doing that, because a lot of these Intel vendors offer some of the same things, you're going to have some overlap in the feeds that you have. So identifying those overlaps and minimizing those overlaps is also key, I think, to minimizing how many different tools you need to accomplish the mission that you have.
Okay, I think these are, it's my turn to do my 1 point, and actually there's not much left to say. I think we're violently agreeing with each other. All I would add to this is that, funnily enough, this is a problem that crops up lots of times, and also one that no matter if you're starting out, I think you have a fairly large established cyber threat intel function. This keeps cropping up again and again, and I think Lance hit the nail on the head. One of the things is, if you, as Benjamin Franklin said, if you fail to plan, you're just planning to fail. I think the most important thing is indeed to kind of identify, well, if you're going to start up this program, what is its purpose going to be? How are you going to add value? So look at indeed stakeholders and use cases. And what I'd say to that is, it's not just when you're starting out, when you have a mature team, but it's also when you have vendors, or even when you are a vendor, that you have these exact same challenges. So whoever asked that question, do please stick around, because at the end, this will be the bit that I want to talk a little bit about. We kind of developed a methodology as a kind of roadmap or a little guidebook to help you either get started with this or build up that intelligence kind of life cycle and kind of plan, do, and then measure and adjust as you're doing it, and all the while go from stakeholders and use cases right down to the individual kind of sources or individual pieces of intelligence that you need, and be able to map how the two are linked together. So basically, this piece of intelligence is relevant for this stakeholder because of this use case, or we need this source of intelligence because this is what we want to achieve, and that's what we need it for. And that, of course, goes into that part of the overlap, indeed. Although, as I think von Clausewitz already said, you can't have enough sources of intelligence, even though sometimes they'll all flatly contradict one another, and they'll all be wrong. So that would be my one top tip. And I think moving on with that, another question for the group: what is the role that cyber threat intelligence plays in the war against cyber threats? And Lance, can you share any insights that have been particularly useful to your team?
Absolutely, and I'm glad that this discussion point is up next, because there's a question here that I think this will answer, and the question is, how can we integrate threat intel into vulnerability management and pen test outcomes? So back to your question, Moritz, I think the role that cyber threat intelligence plays in the war against cyber threats is that cyber threat intelligence, or CTI for brevity's sake, is I think, and I'm a little biased, obviously, as a threat intel guy, that CTI is the best possible way to leverage risk-based strategies. And knowing who the bad guys are, maintaining a constant awareness of their capability, their intent, and their opportunity. Those things, I think, will help you best prepare your defenses because you are learning, even though the threat landscape changes constantly, you're learning what the latest tactics, techniques, and procedures are so that you can adjust your internal detections or your automation around some of the enrichment that you bring into your teams. And going to the question that was asked by the audience, integrating threat intel into vulnerability management is a very, very, in my opinion, a very important role because there are always going to be thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities out there, given all of the applications and platforms that we all use. So learning how to triage those based on threat intelligence and learning from threat intelligence about exploits or the availability of proof of concept files that are being traded on the either the cyber underground or in the open on public repositories, and learning how to triage your vulnerabilities so that you target the ones that are the greatest risk to you. For example, some vulnerabilities may have may be highly complex. They may have other dependencies that need to succeed in order for that vulnerability to be exploitable. Maybe it needs to be publicly accessible. Maybe it needs for something else to fail within your environment before it is fully exploitable. So learning that also from threat intelligence, how are the threat actors leveraging this vulnerability? And figuring out, okay, can they do the same thing within our environment? If so, how do we shore up our defenses for that aspect of the vulnerability? So triage, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and whether or not a proof of concept or exploit is already available. One thing that I've seen is that there is a life cycle of vulnerability exploitation on the cyber underground. So knowing what that life cycle is from your intelligence vendor will help you triage those vulnerabilities appropriately. And then the same goes for pen testing, penetration testing. Is once you know what the tactics, techniques, and procedures are, you know how to try to reproduce some of that in your own environment and see whether or not you're susceptible to that. Going back to the data point or the discussion point that Moritz asked about what role CTI plays in the war against cyber threats, I think that CTI fits into so many different areas, not just within security in any organization. I think that CTI can help inform your users, as I mentioned earlier, the vulnerable teams within your organization, the ones that deal with the public the most. They could benefit from phishing education and lures. What are the latest lures? So I think that CTI can help answer that question, help training your organization, because phishing is, I think, still, even today, the number one. Phishing and social engineering are the number one initial vectors for threat actors into an organization. And then also leveraging a threat intelligence platform to more quickly identify maliciousness within your environment. I'm a big fan of getting all of my feeds into the threat intelligence platform because I like seeing the holistic picture. There are some who disagree and say, no, you should leverage them independently. And by all means, I do that. But I find great value in coalescing all of that data into one platform so that we can identify maliciousness in our environment and be able to tackle that appropriately, as well as having all of the enrichment and the historical data that goes along with some of the indicators we might see. And then finally, converging all of your information within your environment into, or I guess I should say, leveraging all of that information from the threat intelligence team and disseminating that appropriately throughout your organization helps to inform the decision makers, and helps them have a risk informed decision making process, because I think threat intelligence can influence the teams that deal with the public. I think it can influence vulnerability management. I think it can help the security teams like incident response make a more informed triaging decision because of the enrichment. And I think that it will help your technology teams as they decide to create some new form of technology or some new algorithms, to understand how are threat actors bypassing some of that technology or bypassing certain algorithm capabilities. And once you inform them of what the latest tactics, techniques, and procedures are for those things, they might shape their decision making for where they go with the next iteration of that technology. So I'll cut it off there, Moritz, and open it up for discussion.
Yeah, I think the just to add slightly to that, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think Intel is super important across all of the teams. It influences all of the different areas of the company. And I think that your Intel providers and the internal intelligence that you're building up adds as a pivot point, if you will. You know, if you think, again, I go back to your different security tools, you know, your security infrastructure, and leveraging what each one is good at, right? And so you may send lots and lots of data to your SIM, lots of intel to your SIM to be matched on, because SIMs handle large amounts of data. And the worst case scenario is you're going to create some false positives, maybe, or non-contextuals. They're not really false positives because you told it to look for it. And that may overwork your SOC a little bit. And so you want to tune that. But the point is, you can handle lots of big data there. Depending on the results of that, this is where it's a back and forth, right? Here are a bunch of things I want you to look out for. Oh, now I've seen this thing. And now I've got my intelligence providers that say, why did I care about this file hash? Oh, this is related to these other things. And it allows you to push that intel down the funnel. Again, something like a SIM being at the top of the funnel. But when you're getting towards the bottom, you're talking about enforcement points, things that have a finite amount of memory, can only block X number of IP addresses, as an example, or file hashes. And so you can surgically walk down that funnel, casting a wide net at the top. And then, depending on the information you receive and looking across your intel providers, be able to get more and more surgical in what you're actually blocking or reporting on at the bottom. So I think, you know, there's a lot of talk about, oh, intelligence isn't indicators. And, you know, that's obviously true, but indicators are an indication of something. So your intel providers, you know, being able to tie those things together, being able to read a report from Intel 471 and understand this, you know, this is what they're talking about, but here's some key things for my machines to look for. And that helps, it helps the human side, but also, you know, the machine to machine side as well, and really trying to find not just a needle in the haystack, but like which haystack you actually want to go start searching through.
Indeed. And I think you made an interesting point there. Are IOCs intelligence? Are they not intelligence? I would say an IOC with context is tactical intelligence. IOCs without context are just, well, it's nice you blocked something, but you're none the wiser
right.
As to what just happened. I think another interesting point you made, Lance, is that you said either looking at intelligence sources in isolation or just combining them all together. And I think automation is one of the key themes of this whole webinar, but I think that's where the tip gives you options to either take the approach of still looking at them in isolation or bringing it all together. So Proper automation gives you the option of choosing whichever approach best suits you. I think it's no secret that Lance likes to bring everything together and then deal with it himself. I wanted to go back just briefly to, and thank you, Lance, for bringing that point up, because I was actually about to think this was the exact bit to weave it into about the vulnerability intelligence. This is actually, I thought it was a really good question, because it's actually a topic that we got time and asked time and time again. And this had also, you mentioned about triaging, it had to do with patch prioritization. We have a number of our customers, a couple of years ago, came to us and said that patching was just becoming a massive, they were being overwhelmed by the number of patches that were coming out. And so they needed to prioritize patching. And that was one of the, when we sat down and discussed this with them, was one of the key things where cyber threat intelligence can help. Because when you want to decide what to patch first, there's a couple of lenses to look at that problem through. The most obvious one is, what does the vendor say? If Cisco says this is a critical patch, then no questions asked, it goes on the list. And the second is the particular component. If this is an internet, is it a system that can be reached from the internet and holds customer data, then it gets patched. But once these are not so clear, then you get into a more an area where there is more option for discussion. And one of the things that you can look at, and Lance already mentioned it, is that actually vulnerabilities have kind of a lifetime on the underground. And it's not so much about looking at which vulnerabilities are popular, because really you can answer that question yourself. Go look in your SIEM, in the logs. You will see which ones are the most popular, because those are the ones that keep hitting you all the time. They're very old ones. Now, the interesting ones are the ones that are up and coming. The one where something has changed, which means that actors will soon be able, or new actors, a new class of actor, that's where that life cycle comes in, will soon be able to exploit this. So think of, if it's just one, if it's a particular exploit which is available in the underground versus that exploit is actually integrated into so-called exploit kits. If it's an exploit by itself, it's a key that fits a particular lock. If it's an exploit kit, it's just a huge ring of master keys, and they just try them on all the locks they can find to see if they can get in, for instance. So with vulnerability intelligence, you actually, turns out you can track that by tracking discussions and tracking known actors. We talked about the marketplace. There are actors that specialize in selling vulnerabilities. And that can go into your patching program. So that's one area where CTI can definitely help. But like all things, it's kind of an input. You won't be replacing everything around patch management with CTI. You obviously still need to be aware of your own footprint, what you have, and what the role of each component is.
Moritz, I'm sorry to jump in here, but
yeah.
but you mentioned something that I thought was key, and that is that a lot of the vulnerabilities that are exploited are very old. They're not 0 days. Although 0 days do tend to, I think, spark the interest of people who are just sort of fly-by-night or script kiddies type of attackers. But I think that the majority of the vulnerabilities that are exploited, especially if you look at what US Cyber is putting out as far as the top exploited vulnerabilities for 2021 or 2020, is that a lot of these are very old, 3, 4, 5 years old. And so on that point, what I'll say is I think there's a lot of value in applying the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, that the majority of the impact is caused by only, the 80% of your impact is caused by 20% of your vulnerabilities in this case. So I'm a big fan of applying that principle to your vulnerability programs and targeting some of those older vulnerabilities. Again, using CTI to triage those and say, which ones do we prioritize first before we start tackling the rest? And so great point about them most of them being older vulnerabilities.
And then to counter that, and this is, you never tire of reading that one where people go, every report will take the input where it says, oh yes, so-and-so got popped by a vulnerability that was 2 years old. And of course the implied thing is, oh, the defenders were hopeless. How can they leave something open for 2 years? Now there's 2 points to that. One is there's still hope for us, because what no one ever does is those attackers were pretty lazy as well. It took them 2 years to get around to exploiting that. So but that's, on the one hand, we can laugh at that, but that does mean that there is time, and that you can actually, for patch prioritization, use this as an input. If every attacker immediately exploited every vulnerable application or component, then you couldn't prioritize anything. It would just be patch everything right now before you're already too late. But thankfully, attackers need a little time to get their house in order as well. And the question is, do we know when the timer runs out? And if we do, we can basically patch just before or well before that happens. But so indeed, I was going to move on to my next question, which is actually going to be how has your team contributed to enhancing the process of cyber threat analysis and prevention? Can you share some examples of particular actions or processes that you found were really helpful?
Absolutely. So I work very closely with our fellow security teams within the organization, but I also try to also work with other friends throughout the industry on best practices. And I will say that helping to provide context, as you mentioned, and indicators without context are just telemetry, basically. And indicators with context are much more useful for internal teams, again, to make that risk-based decision, risk-informed decision. So I would say that providing enrichment and context for indicators as they come in, and helping teams triage a little faster with whatever their goal is, whether it be pen testing, vulnerability management, incident response, helping those teams to triage a little faster and also to make more informed decisions through the context is, I found to be highly beneficial within your organization. I'll also say visibility into underground activity, what's going on in the underground as far as breaches and compromised credentials. And this goes both for your customers as well as your employees and your senior leadership teams. So maintaining an awareness of what are the latest breaches that have been advertised on the cyber underground, and acting on those as quickly as possible is one of the ways that we've helped to provide threat analysis and prevention. And then finally, working closely with your internal threat hunt team, if you have one, is also very important. Identifying areas within the environment where proactive investigation might help to identify risk areas. And maybe there's not a threat posed right now per se, but one is likely to come on the horizon. So you want to make sure that you get ahead of that by working with your threat hunt teams and telling them about, let's say, some recent reporting that you saw from your premium vendors, or just something that's been reported in the OSINT news, something that provides relevance to your organization, but also areas where you need to focus some proactive investigations. So all of these are ways that I think cyber threat intelligence helps to push security initiatives, not just within your team, but also throughout your organization.
Okay, and talking about this, what is the most common threat that Clear faces versus the threat that actually concerns it the most?
I think, as any organization in the industry, I think we're all sort of concerned about e-crime and ransomware, or concerned about APT actors, nation state actors, whether or not that applies to your organization. And so that's one of the things that I always fear, just because I am sort of a risk averse person. I'd like to stay informed so that I hedge any risk I might see. So I'll say just sort of coyly that rather than specifying specific threats that we face, that I think teams are best served focusing on the threats that impact their ability to serve their customers or to fulfill their mission, and to secure their resources. I'll also say that I try to stay pretty well aligned on that front and reevaluate often to ensure that I stay focused on today's threats and the risks that I'm seeing both on the underground as well as OSINT reporting. And finally, I'm always in attack surface reduction mode. So anytime I read something, and whether it's an intelligence estimate from a premium provider or whether that is something that I read on cybersecurity reporting, I look at each one of those and I say, does that apply to me? Is that something that applies to our organization? That particular threat actor or that particular malware, is that something that could potentially pose a threat to us? If so, what do I need to do to secure our environment? Which teams do I need to work with in addition to the threat hunt team and doing proactive investigation? Has that already happened? So I'll say that that to me is, I think, the best way for organizations to fight against the threats that they see. I learned recently from a friend of mine in the organization about identifying your contact threats and your horizon threats. So the contact threats are the threats that your threat intelligence platform, your TIP, is identifying in your environment now or at your perimeter. And your horizon threats are the threats that you're likely to face because other similar vertical teams are dealing with those now. And so identifying both of those within our environment is crucial for me to make sure that we hedge against that.
And I think you touched upon I think it's an important part of your overall cybersecurity approach. But of course, the two themes here were CTI specifically and automation. But I think developing good contacts and information sharing with your peers or with people in other verticals and sharing information like that is also a very good approach to kind of together we all see more, as it were. So on the subject of seeing more, doing better, what tips would you have about to providers? What can they do to deliver or to better help your organization fight, or organizations like you, to fight cyber threats?
I have a deep interest in this, and I work with our vendors closely to, if they're not already putting out some of the helpful things for me, then is that something they could do in the future? So I'll say first, context is really key in this area. One of the biggest advantages, I think, to having a premium vendor is that you get that holistic view because they have visibility into both the cyber underground as well as OSINT reporting, and they can sort of synthesize that into useful and relevant information with their intelligence estimates. So receiving that, I think, is very helpful. Insights, projections, and trend analysis can be very helpful for teams and decision makers. What are the phishing trends that you're seeing now in a lot of these spam bots? And that's helpful for me in terms of how to secure against those. And then also, like, let's say, for example, what verticals were targeted the most? What is the chatter saying for specific vulnerabilities or weaknesses? What are the high interest vulnerabilities or high interest weaknesses that threat actors are exploiting? That will also help me figure out where we need to protect ourselves. And then finally, I think that intelligence providers have a unique visibility that I don't, that is on the underground, and being able to stay ahead of where the threat actors are going as they shut down one site and open up another site. That visibility that they have is very crucial for me because I don't want to trudge around on the cyber underground. I don't have the time, and I frankly don't want the risk for myself. So having the intelligence vendors be able to provide that insight, and also translation services and things like that are very, very helpful. So those things being passed out as finished intelligence is very helpful, I think, from intelligence vendors.
Okay, well, Thank you very much, and double thank you, because I think you just answered one of the audience questions. What are the best ways to monitor the underground chatter, and what are the best feeds to subscribe to? The person asking the question already suggested Intel 471. Obviously, my answer is yes, that is the best. But I think the points you made about looking at the chatter yourself, you don't want to be trudging around and doing all of that yourself. Yes, it's nice to be able to access that raw data, obviously, and you can. But your point about the finished intelligence and people actually already either translating or providing the necessary context so that you can consume that is probably as important, if not more important, than just the monitoring the underground chatter yourself.
Moritz, sorry, just one more
No.
point about having a premium vendor with visibility into the underground. It's incredibly helpful to be able to do searches as well, because those forums, those key forums are scraped, for example. That makes it searchable, and you can put in alerting queries to alert you anytime a discussion is happening about something that you find important. So that's one thing I forgot to add to that a premium provider can offer.
Yes, and I'll add to that, and the archive, because funnily enough, underground forums have a habit of disappearing. And sometimes people withdraw some of the things they say there because things change and we no longer want this. We no longer want this out there. But in the case of scraping, too late. I think the discussion overran a little, but I think that's good. That was the point of this webinar. But we do want to spend a couple of minutes at the end to talk about the joys of automation and also the joys of cyber threat intelligence. So for now, I'll hand over to Chris with a couple of slides on how automation can help your efforts.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. And this kind of like the commercial at the end of the television show here, brought to you by, but I'll be very brief. I've only got 2 slides. This first one, I think, is a good representation of our approach to threat intelligence and threat intelligence management. And really, the main point of this slide is bringing in all of the sources of intel, be that premium feeds such as Intel 471, be it OSINT feeds, be it internal data, putting that all into what we call a threat library or a single source of truth, and being able to manage that data and make decisions that are data-driven decisions. And then, this builds a constant loop here, because we're making these decisions, and then we're automating, if that's anything from auto enrichment to pushing things to a SIM to sending the ops team some new IPS rules. We're integrating with all of these different security systems, and then creating this feedback loop. Right, once this thing gets started, it should just run constantly. More data in, more data out. As data comes back, we're making decisions on that. And again, it's all data driven. So what do I mean by data driven? Well, as SOAR came to light and playbooks, automated playbooks or orchestration became more and more in style, if you will. They brought a great tool to the market. You could really do anything with it. But the problem that we've seen is that you can do anything with it. And as a result, it's very complex to build out what should be relatively simple playbooks or automations, right? And so we have gone in a different direction. Instead of being this very process-driven playbook, which there is still, even for physical playbooks, there's always going to be a need for process-driven things. Our approach, however, with automation in CTI is more of a data-driven approach, and it's building collections, smart collections, and then deciding what to do on changes to those collections, right? Here is some additional information I didn't have. I'm going to kick off some automated enrichment on this. I am going to maybe run this through an NLP parser to pull, additional information out of a report. But it's being very focused on automating through the lens of CTI versus this giant, I can do anything with it sort of process-driven orchestration platform. And that's it. As I said, I'll be as brief as possible. I really came just to hear Lance talk. So thanks for listening to my little commercial, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, in that vein, we'll talk a little bit about what we do at Intel 471. And I think in kind of keeping with what we talked about during the discussion, I think this slide tries to capture the whole point of cyber threat intelligence, which is to what we try and do is help our customers be proactive when it comes to mitigating cyber risk, move to a more proactive approach. We focus on two areas: actor communications and tracking the technology that those same actors are using. So we have what we call adversary intelligence and malware intelligence. And the little arrow between the two at the top was actually very important because if you track the threat from both of these perspectives, you can actually, when you're able to link the actor to the tool and the tool to the actor, you can actually look at that same threat from both of those perspectives. You can look at the technology angle, or you can look at the actor behind it, what they're trying to accomplish, etc. So that's more context, as it were. And the way we do that is we have a large team of researchers and analysts, and we collect a lot of data. So the key thing here is that collecting data is one part of it, but the ability to both run sources and interact with actors, but also to analyze and understand that data and provide that context is actually key. And we focus on the adversary and the malware, but the products that we actually turn them into, or some of them are specifically aimed at specific problems. So we talked about vulnerability intelligence, but another area that we kind of build products specifically to apply, so make it more easy to apply CTI, is in the sphere of stolen credentials. When we look at the cyber underground and we look at the way that threats develop and play out, it's amazing how many threats, ransomware, but a whole host of other things start with something relatively simple as a credential going missing. So focusing on stopping that, detecting that, and stopping it that early is one of the key things around credential intelligence. You'll see a bit there says boots on the ground. That is one of the things that we believe in very strongly. To do this work and to kind of blend into the background, we want to have researchers and analysts that are actually in region. This sounds really odd because this is all cyber. We've mentioned the word cyber about 24 times. But to be able to effectively kind of blend into the background, you need people with very up-to-date local and cultural knowledge to basically most effectively do that, we've found. So that's why our team is dotted around the globe, everywhere where there is a cyber hotspot. And we deliver that intelligence to our customers who are also located around the globe. Now, for the question on how you do this, we've developed what we call the general intelligence requirements methodology, back to the point of how to get started with this. And the idea is to allow you to kind of use that methodology. And Chris will like this, it's actually based on a methodology developed by the US Marine Corps, their GIR. We just added a cyber booklet to the range. But the idea is that it allows you to go from stakeholders to use cases to intelligence requirements. And then those intelligence requirements are mapped onto what's called the general intelligence requirements taxonomy. So it's a structure of intelligence requirements, in our case, as they apply to the cyber underground. So no matter what intelligence requirement you have, it can always be mapped onto the closest matching GIR. And in the methodology for each particular general intelligence requirements, that describes the essential elements of information. So the bits of data or information or intelligence that you need to satisfy or answer that general intelligence requirement. So when we collect intelligence and when we write reporting, we will actually mark it or tag it with the GIRs it satisfies because it contains one or more of those essential elements of information. So that brings a whole structure that allows you to measure how well your program is doing, It allows you to identify what type of sources you need. And on a day-to-day level, very simply, given your intelligence requirements, it allows you to build collection plans, but it also allows you, for instance, to simply go in and immediately identify the reports or the bits of intelligence that are relevant for a particular stakeholder, and to pass them along. So the idea is that it really operationalizes working with intel requirements. It enables you to be proactive when gathering intelligence. This is one of the key struggles, right? If you have intelligence requirements, but you can't deduplicate them, so you've collected them from all your stakeholders, you can't deduplicate them, then they become too big to work with. And so you end up on the reactive side of things again. You collect intel when there's a pressing need, an incident, or when the opportunity presents itself. But if you're able to kind of structure them in this way, you can actually start proactively collecting. And importantly, to the person asking the question, it also allows you to quantify how well you're doing and demonstrate that you're providing the ROI. As Chris said, that is the end of this little commercial break. We've gone a couple of minutes over. All that remains for me to do is to thank our panelists for sharing their insights and for joining us. Lance, Chris, and for you, the audience, for all your good questions that you asked, and for allowing us to bend your ear for the better part of an hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Thanks, Lance.
Appreciate it.